So this is where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. Does the mainstream media's obsession with exposing even illicit Downing Street parties prove that they can't let lockdown go? So The Guardian, didn't they? They thought they had a gotcha moment when they exposed the now infamous picture of Boris Johnson, Carrie, Matt Hancock and co. enjoying an alleged outdoor business meeting during the first lockdown in May 2020. But my guest tonight, Spiked editor Tom Slater, argues that instead of exposing the lefty press as curtain twitchers who didn't give a damn, frankly, about fighting for our civil liberties, in his column Cheese and Winegate, the media have lost the plot. Tom writes, I am as enraged by the government's hypocrisy as the rules as anyone, but the preoccupation with all this is getting a little bit weird. Our COVID martial media are still so gripped by lockdown moralism, they seem never to notice the many moral outrages of lockdown. And I know for a fact, because on my normal show, every single weekday, cheeky little plug, 9:30am until 12pm, I always have the GBNews inbox in front of me. So I can see in real time what you lovely lot are thinking. And to be honest with you, a lot of you thought what Tom thinks. Well, Tom joins me now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving us your time, Tom. Look, there is the fact, isn't there, that if you do create some rules and you make sure that other people live under those rules, and that has an impact on people's day-to-day lives, and then it appears that maybe you broke those rules, that is a bit rum, isn't it?
Oh, of course it is. And I was outraged by the first 2 or 3 of these scandals, shall we say. But whilst you get up to 6 or 7 or 8, and you're talking about a Zoom quiz rather than a drive to Durham, or a few drinks after work rather than some kind of raucous party, I think we start to see the pattern here, which is just the media have got really quite preoccupied with this. You can understand why. It's a good story. It's embarrassing for the government. On some level, the job of the media is to embarrass the government. But I think it does speak to a broader problem with our media throughout the past 2 years, which is that they're really obsessed with these rules, almost to the kind of exclusion of some of the more substantive issues like the lockdown policy. And I think we saw that with the Cheese and Winegate thing, which I can't have been the only one who thought, really, is this it? And that story came.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think as well that it's a bit of a problem because do you actually look at a lot of the media now, a lot of elements of that mainstream media and think, hang on a minute, do you quite like a lockdown?
You certainly get that sense. I mean, I can't be the only one looking at some of the reporting of the new data from the UK HSA on the Omicron variant being, 70% less likely to hospitalise you than Delta. And they almost seemed crestfallen about all of this. And I don't want to overdo this, but I think there was something whereby, for whatever reason, the media really got behind what I call this kind of lockdown moralism. They were really obsessed with the rules. We all remember back in kind of April, May 2020, all of those splashes of anyone sitting closer than 2 metres together, sunbathers sitting on their own with no one for 50 yards around, were shamed and packed and all the rest of it. And for whatever reason, I think it brought out the curtain twitching nature of them, the authoritarian nature, and the fact that none of them ever stopped to say, hold on a second, even if this is the right path to go down, we're being stripped of our civil liberties in a way that has never happened since wartime, I think speaks to some of the problems the media has with groupthink and with sensationalism over the substance.
Oh, and hypocrisy as well, Tom. Hypocrisy, rampant hypocrisy. There are certain people in our industry who work at another certain media outlet. Of course, how could I possibly name Kay Burley on national television? But the fact is, she wasn't exactly all over the rules, was she? And now she's got the kind of brass neck, frankly, to go and get people sitting in front of her, government ministers saying, shouldn't you resign? Shouldn't you resign? Peston didn't care about having a mask on, did he? He was with a couple of other people at that Downing Street press conference. All of a sudden, he almost throws up moralism towards our politicians. Why did this not get off?
I really don't know what drives it, because as you say, we all know that they bent the rules, because everyone bent the rules. I mean, some of these rules were utterly ridiculous. We all know that. And I think this is what the other thing is, that when you saw some of these stories in recent weeks, so for instance, the horror that a group of 20, 30 people who work in quite close proximity in Downing Street all day long, the idea that they would have cheese and wine at the end of that day is suddenly epidemiologically so much more disastrous than them working together. We all know these things are slightly ridiculous. We all know that particularly people who were out working during the pandemic, which is the majority of people, we should remember, did naturally bend the rules because it's hard not to. So many of them are so ridiculous. I don't know what the hypocrisy speaks to necessarily, but for whatever reason, a lot of the media have to feel that they have to kind of indulge in this myth that everyone followed these often quite ridiculous rules to the letter, when they should have spent a lot of time exposing how ridiculous those rules were.
And what drives it, do you think? Because there's this eternal question, the kind of chicken and egg situation of the media versus public opinion, and what drives what. Now, when we see the opinion polls, trust them as far as you can throw them, of course, about the amount of people who wanted a lockdown, the amount of people who are in favour of more restrictions. Well, if every single time they turn on Chris Whitty and co.'s doom-mongering slideshows, and all they see is the questions from people going, why aren't there more restrictions? Why aren't there more restrictions? Then does that not start to have an impact on the public psyche? Or do you think the media were reflecting the public mood?
In a sense, I think it's a bit of both, because one of the interesting things about the first lockdown was the fact that you actually saw faith in the media being incredibly low. I mean, it's usually quite low anyway. But one of the things that you saw a lot of responses from members of the public was that they didn't like this gotcha journalism. Yes, they were behind the lockdown policy. Ridiculous daily. Why haven't you brought in the police yet? Why aren't the restrictions tougher? Anecdotes thrown at the Prime Minister. I saw 3 people in a pub last night, so obviously things aren't working. That sort of stuff really did bother them. And I think the broader issue with the media, I think the thing about the pandemic is it exacerbated all of the problems that already existed with the media. They have a tendency towards groupthink. They tend not to think the public are particularly intelligent, so they need to be sort of led by the nose.
Absolutely.
And they have this desire for kind of gotcha journalism, just a scalp for the sake of it, rather than looking at the substance. I think we saw that all of that kind of crash together in March last year.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. They're like sharks in the water when there's a bit of blood dotted about, and all of a sudden it's like resignation, and that's a good day out for them. You can just see now Peston, can't you, popping the moe when someone resigns. You think, well, actually, hang on a minute. Did they need to go? What situation has that actually put the country in? Has it added to the chaos now? Was it necessary? And I think that's potentially a little bit of an issue there, really, Tom. And I do find it absolutely fascinating, really, the way that people are still kind of focusing on this. Do you think that, frankly, now the public has just turned and that, really, they've stopped caring about what may or may not have happened about a year ago?
I think they have, because I think all of these scandals, really, people are mainly preoccupied with their own situation. That's why a lot of them irritate them at first, because they think, I've been following the rules, or we're still having to suffer under these restrictions, and yet, look, they're laughing in our faces. But I think that wine and cheese thing feels like weeks ago, frankly. It was only really at the beginning of this week that story actually broke. And I think it shows how much things tend to move on, really. And I think this is something that the media doesn't necessarily get, because they're still running around basically making noise about rules that were broken last year. Meanwhile, the public just want to know when their lives are getting back to normal, and that seems to be what people mainly care about.
Could I politely suggest as well to a lot of those media types in this country, whilst you're spending a lot of your time and energy in your daily work hours apparently desperately trying to find a picture of whether or not someone may have eaten some cheese in the Downing Street garden, could we maybe spend a little bit longer looking into the efficacy and indeed any potential issues with things like the vaccines, maybe some things like the mental health issues that come associated with lockdown, things that are important, things that really matter to people. Ferreting around trying to see whether or not Boris Johnson took Dylan out for a wee in the back lawn when he was supposed to be upstairs looking after the baby or something. No one really cares, in my opinion. But, Tom, thank you very, very much. I could talk to you all night. Tom Slater there, of course, the editor of Spiked Online. Make sure you check that out as well.